Welcome everyone to BeBop's Pre-NAB 2019 webinar. If you hadn't guessed, I'm Michael Kamas, Director of Business Development here at BeBop. I'm so thrilled to share some tech with you today, and it's great to see so many familiar faces, or should I say names, in the webinar today. So thank you, all of you, for taking time out during the day to join us. I'm also really excited to have Brian Glover, if you look on the sidebar over there, who's the Director of Media Engineering for Vice Media. Yes, that Vice Media. He's with us today for a unique perspective on how Vice Media works with BeBop, which is very cool. Now, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see some very familiar logos. You're probably familiar with Amazon, and I'm willing to bet you know Google and Microsoft, but what is new down there is Autodesk. What's new is that BeBop and Autodesk recently announced the availability of Autodesk software for VFX like Maya on the BeBop Cloud platform. What makes this so exciting is that it adds to the already existing tool set that we already have in the BeBop platform. You've already used tools like Premiere Pro and After Effects to do creative editorial and VFX. Now we have Autodesk to do even more VFX and creative work. So I think this is going to be fantastic for anyone who wants to create more on the platform with different tools. And it really complements the existing tools that we already have with Adobe. And due to what we do on the BeBop platform with review and approve and live collaboration, both of these tools play directly in to the ability to collaborate anywhere in the world with anyone, which is just fantastic. I highly recommend that you check out the tech section of the BeBop Technology website after the webinar, obviously, but check that out to read all the good news. With that being said, I'm going to pass the baton over to Dave Benson, who's the CTO and co-founder of BeBop. So David, take it away.
Thank you very much, Michael. Good morning, everybody, and thank you again for joining us. As Michael said, we're very, very delighted, honored to have our guest Brian Glover here from Vice Media. As Michael said, yes, that Vice Media, the one that we all know and love. And we're going to be talking about some exciting stuff that we have been doing with Vice that we've implemented very recently. Some workflows that are actually fully in service and in full production at this point in Vice. And then we're also going to start talking about a lot of the future planning, other tools, and so on that we have on the BeBop platform that we're planning to implement with Vice moving forward with Brian and his team. So I'll introduce Brian Glover, and Brian, why don't you give us a quick overview of what you do at Vice, and then we can jump in.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Dave. So I'm part of the media technology team at Vice Media. It's an arm of the tech org that spun off about 2 years ago to bring together folks from broadcast engineering, production, post-production, and the IT realm to better serve our creative team. So I'm the head of the director of the media engineering group over there. And we had a unique problem, and we saw BeBop as a unique answer. So excited to share a little bit more details on that.
Great. All right, let's dive in. So as we see here, I'm gonna let Brian walk through this in much more detail. But essentially, this is what is happening as we speak at Vice Media and has been in place for many months now. Generally speaking, we have a workflow that is moving existing contribution feeds, linear feeds, and static content from on-prem at Vice into BeBop, where one of the remote editors is leveraging today and planning on many more moving into the future. So Brian, why don't you give us your more detailed and a little more color than I'm going to version of this, and we can hit on a couple points on the way in.
Sure. Yeah. Let me just set the stage a little bit for this. If you're not familiar with Vice, we historically come from the world of print, but we've grown into one of the, if not the preeminent youth media news organizations around today. So we've been in the business of video production for about 10 years with properties ranging from film to scripted television to a nightly newscast on HBO. 3-time Emmy winner, going to call that out for Vice News tonight. Congrats to that team. And a wide array of other digital properties and verticals. We have offices in 20+ countries. So we've scaled unmanageably, almost to a degree, I would say. Over the past 3 years in our Brooklyn office alone, we went from 200 to 1,200 employees. And you can imagine all the growing pains that you go through with some sort of a scaling of that scale, of that size, I should say. So, I mean, we were ultimately, we needed to find a more flexible and creative way to post-produce for some of these edge case scenarios that we're presented with. There are only so many people we can fit into our production facility, much to the chagrin of the post executives. They would love it if we had infinite seating. Unfortunately, that's not possible. And that brings us to our specific use case that's outlined in this workflow diagram here. The tech org was presented with a pretty unique problem. One of the news team's highly regarded editors was going to relocate to Philadelphia. His wife had gotten a job opportunity on there she couldn't turn down, so had to relocate. But the producers at Vice in New York wanted to maintain him on their roster without having him commuting back and forth regularly and disrupting his life. So ultimately, the business was asking us to solve the problem of solving meaningful remote contribution, which is something that we've really struggled with for quite a while. So we went through a process of requirement gathering, and after a short discovery phase and a nudge from our friends at Adobe, I should call out that we're an entirely Premiere house, BeBop came into the picture. So what BeBop offered us was a seamless way to quickly sync projects, templates, associated assets, et cetera, to production storage in the cloud for access to edit from any location with a minimal amount of bandwidth requirement. The entire Adobe suite is available there. As mentioned, fonts and plugins, anything that you would need can be pre-installed there. And just from my initial experience with just touching a BeBop workstation, the first thing that immediately jumped out to me was just the responsiveness. I'm demoing on my tiny 11-inch MacBook. I'm controlling a workstation in the cloud that is, to be completely honest, better spec than anything we have on-prem. And it feels like I'm sitting in front of that workstation. Audio and video are tightly in sync with one another. Keyboard commands are committed in a prompt manner, and it feels very organic. And I'm not exaggerating when I say it is genuinely hard to tell the difference when you really get into the zone and you're really, cutting and moving and shaking. Other notes around this before we really get into this workflow, from a security standpoint, obviously 2FA is available, which is fantastic. It's a requirement on our end. The admin interface is complete with all these rich analytics. There's Rocket, which is a high-speed file transfer protocol that they've rolled out, and it really kind of rolls into this workflow diagram that's detailed here. So once we onboarded this editor into the BeBop environment, we got him up and running in about a day, I would say. He was able to go in, send, receive assets to and from production storage in New York. He's able to coordinate with the AE team to media manage products up to him within BeBop, so he can edit, export, send the final back down to New York for review and publication, and all very seamlessly and painlessly. And again, it happened over a very short period of time. So that's when the editor brought a more complex problem to us, which is around these contribution feeds. So he wanted to be able to take advantage of these contribution feeds that are coming in at a day-to-day basis to our master control room. They might be news feeds, as you can see in the top left there, like AP, Reuters, ABC News, et cetera, that we subscribe to, or it could be field teams. So maybe a Vice field team is out in the Midwest somewhere. We need to be able to do frame chase editing or similar within the same kind of constraints of the BeBop environment. And we found a way to do that. And ultimately, it's not through frame chase editing per se, but it's what I'll refer to as faux real-time editing. So we take in those feeds with our baseband recorders, the master control room team does, whether it's whether a Cinedex or a MOG or what have you, and we started writing 10-minute segmented files to a BeBop wash folder that's sitting on our on-prem production storage. So from there, it takes about 2 to 3 minutes, depending, before the assets become available within the BeBop edit pod. But that ultimately means that every 12 to 13 minutes, the editor is getting 10 more minutes of footage to work with in real time. So again, this isn't frame chase editing, but the editor found this to be more than acceptable for his use cases. So he's able to edit the feed as it's coming in, like I said, in faux real time, quote unquote, export the final to the hot folder in BeBop production storage, and that seamlessly lands back on our production storage in New York for, like I said, for review and ultimately for submission to the stack for playout that evening. He's able to contribute in that meaningful of a way that it very closely emulates some of the on-prem workflows that we have in place currently. And all of this is done from the comfort of his home ultimately, right? So not everyone is keen on having the convenience of working from home. I'm sure the post executives wouldn't be too happy if we were able to offer that convenience up to everyone. It's almost become a bit of a burden because it is so convenient. But overall, throughout this entire process, we found a pretty creative way for this editor to take advantage of the existing broadcast infrastructure in Brooklyn within the BeBop environment, working from an entirely different location, and we're continuing to work with Dave and team to stand up more sophisticated solutions for these kind of problems in the not so distant future.
Awesome, Brian. Thank you. So I wanted to kind of go back and hit on a couple things that you mentioned and point out almost how fluidly you kind of rolled over them, because I think they've become almost second nature at this point. But you mentioned in terms of the time it took us to get this editor onboarded and this entire workflow in place and into production, you mentioned it was about a day or so. So that's a pretty fundamental thing that I want to just point out for everybody online today or anybody watching in the future. This is not something that requires, massive project teams. It does not require massive project planning, project management, all of the things that I think most of us are probably very, very used to when even having conversations about setting up something like this without BeBop. You would certainly be having infrastructure purchase orders and things like that flying all over the place. And it really just is not necessary when you put BeBop into the picture as we're looking at today. We have the ability in multiple regions, multiple clouds with multiple tools, as Michael said at the top end of this, to really get a workflow like this up and running in production and have your editors or any of your artists or anyone using these workstations up and running wherever they are in a very fluid and easy manner. So that's
just to highlight that, David. I mean, this was a team of 2 on our end, and then the actual editor himself that stood up this workflow with your support team within a day. I think that really speaks towards how painless this can be and how easy it can be to, with a little bit of finagling, maintain that roster of your premier editors, no pun intended. Even if they decide to relocate, they can still contribute in a meaningful way.
Yes, exactly. And that brings me to my second point, is that, as you can see in this diagram, the way that we have depicted this, there's not a really clear indication between on-prem and off-prem, right? Obviously, we've got the on-prem indicated in the baseband recorder here, but the point is really that, as Brian said very eloquently, it's blurring the lines between, what we refer to as cloud and on-prem today, but the reality is that we really shouldn't care. Right? Your artist shouldn't care. Your editor should not care. All they need to know is that they have their BeBop account, their 2-factor authentication, and that they have an ample amount of bandwidth wherever they're sitting. From that point forward, everything should just work and all the tools should be at their fingertips. So from here, Brian, what I wanted to get into a little bit here is specifically around this, the term you use, which believe it or not, probably has already shown up on our website because I love that term. The faux real-time editing. That was an interesting step that you guys actually took on your own and figured out. So talk a little bit about that, because I think that's really important.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, typically what we do is when these contribution feeds are coming in, the MCR team on-prem in New York would pass off a file path ultimately to the editors, and they would do frame chase editing within Premiere. We couldn't do that currently, but in the BeBop environment. But what we discovered is these same tools have the ability to do the same kind of workflow, just in a different way. So instead of having one, self-contained file that is constantly growing for the editor to access and edit with, we're talking about 10-minute segments being lopped off of this feed as it's coming in, and it is contiguous. We're not losing frames in between the segments, so they get all of the video information that they need in a timely manner. It's just there's that 10-minute buffer as opposed to it being immediate. And like I said, the editor was really like, I have so much footage to go through. Being able to frame chase edit almost becomes an inconvenience to a degree because I'm just constantly getting in new footage and I'm needing to go in and subclip and make my markers. It's almost more palatable to just be getting it in 10-minute chunks in the same way that I would receive, camera rolls from out in the field. So we used our existing broadcast infrastructure and the baseband recorders that we had on-prem to really easily make that switch from growing file to segmented file. And all of a sudden, boom, we're ultimately close to editing in real time in a cloud environment.
Yeah, and so you said something just now again that I want to point out. The phrase that you used was doing the normal workflow that you're used to, just slightly differently. And that's a really, really critical concept that is something that we talk about a lot at BeBop, because the reality is that cloud workflows and on-prem workflows are not exactly the same. That's the reality. But the good news is that they can be almost exactly similar if you're willing to accept a little bit of a half step to the left or to the right, is the way I usually say it. And this is a perfect case of that, as you just described. And what comes out the other end, if the editors and the organization around it that's used to supporting on-prem workflows can do it slightly differently, then there's a tremendous amount of value proposition that comes out the other end. So with that, Brian, let's move over to talk about some future stuff. There's two big logos on the screen now, right now, in terms of talking about the BeBop disaster recovery and BeBop over the shoulder. Normally, these are two different topics that we would typically cover, sometimes do a demonstration of over the shoulder. But today, what we wanted to talk about is both of them almost in the same context of disaster recovery, because this is a lot of the planning that we've started to do with Brian and with his team. And I'll let Brian kind of lead us into this topic, because there's a lot here, and it's a very interesting perspective that Brian and his team have come up with on how to leverage these tools.
Sure. And let me kind of, again, set the stage for this workflow. Another project that came to our team this year was specifically around disaster recovery for our news team. Should the office in New York become inaccessible for some reason, which, to be honest, isn't completely out of the ordinary. We live a block off the river in Brooklyn. So, it's a completely realistic situation where that would happen. We're contractually obligated to deliver a show 4 days a week. We needed a contingency plan for those worst case scenarios. So, we started shopping around. We looked into replicating our production control room services at some offsite facility. It quickly became clear that doing this, even in a region where tax laws make it a little bit easier pill to swallow, it was still cost prohibitive. So instead of taking that giant leap, what we did is we kind of met in the middle somewhere. What we ended up doing was retrofitting our DC bureau to act as a secondary edit and playout facility. That said, it's a very small facility. We can't accommodate the entire Vice News post and production staff out of this smaller facility that is usually staffed by less than 10 people, obviously. So what we use BeBop for is to supplement that ultimately. So by giving the editors and the producers a secondary way to collaborate for these day of air pieces, we've effectively solved that problem. So we moved the crucial core personnel to the DC office. So should something happen where we can't get into Brooklyn, and then the other ancillary staff that are still very important to what we do could operate out of the BeBop environment when there's, quite frankly, just not enough room to keep everyone in the DC bureau. So what we're starting to design is kind of a methodology and a workflow for doing that, because it has to be preemptive, right? We don't know if flood's going to happen tomorrow. So we need to be able to plan up against that. So what we've done and what we're going to continue doing, is basically earmarking projects and associated media and preemptively syncing them to our DC bureau over our private lines, which we also have in place, considerably more expensive though. But also in parallel, syncing these same projects to BeBop edit storage. So giving the teams the ability to have options as to where and how they work with their media. And the OTS module, which is the other side of this, ensures that the staff can still edit and review in real time wherever they may be, provided they have a relatively small amount of bandwidth, and they can still collaborate with one another in, as David said, the same kind of way, just maybe a half step to the left or to the right. And what they quickly realize is, yes, this is different, and usually different scares people, but also, wow, this feels very similar to what we do on-prem. It feels organic. The workstation is responsive. I have the assets and the plugins and the fonts and things like that I need, and it just makes sense. So overall, what we have is, a hybrid of the DC bureau and BeBop as our DR solution. And, should they need to edit out of the BeBop environment, using the known good tools like their high-speed file transfer Rocket, we can easily sync those assets back down to our DC office, which would be acting as our secondary, DR playout center. So it makes DR a lot more palatable, is what I would say. So we're really happy with what we've seen so far and looking forward to pushing it a little further in the not so distant future.
Thanks, Brian. So I want to again go back to a couple of things you hit on here. So the thing that strikes me the most about this, and this is a real world example of things that we've talked about a lot in the past in BeBop conceptually, but you guys are Vice Media, right? Very well known, obviously we'll just say a very well funded news organization. And even in your context, the notion of what we'll call a traditional backup or disaster recovery scenario was just simply cost prohibitive. And I think that I would go on, I would make an assumption that that's a similar position that almost anyone on this, listening to this webinar today or will be listening to it, no matter where organization you are in, whether it's a large multinational media corporation or a small production house, this topic of disaster recovery is a very, very challenging one. And as you said just a second ago, the blurring of the lines between what we call disaster recovery and what is really just the BeBop platform that you use day in, day out, they really do start to blur into the same thing, which is a beautiful thing, because you almost get, you get two solutions in one at the same time. So the over-the-shoulder piece, as I mentioned, this is typically a standalone, product that we have at BeBop. We make it available for all platform users, free of charge. And so talk a little bit about how this falls into and kind of merges into the overall disaster recovery workflow, right? From a collaboration standpoint, if there is an inability for people to get to certain sites or get to certain content that may be in that site, how does the over-the-shoulder piece contribute to that overall workflow?
Sure. Well, I mean, the story producers and post producers still want to be involved in the edit. It's one thing that your editor, I should say, has the media that they need and they can keep working on it. But there's still an aspect of review and approval that is involved in that. So with the OTS module, we have the ability to very easily dial in on that edit session, and we can give notes and feedback in real time and really collaborate in the same way. I mean, the name says it all, right? It's like these folks are right over your shoulder. It's like all you have to do is walk down the hall and just tap them on the shoulder and you can give them feedback, but we're operating in a cloud environment. So I just think that it really could do wonders should that worst case scenario ever occur. Like I said, it's a small office down in DC. We can't move a staff with 200 or 300 people down there, but this kind of finds a way to bridge all the gaps for the folks that can't go down to the secondary facility, such that they can still, as I said, review and edit in real time and work with one another and have that same aspect of review and approval integrated within the experience.
Awesome. So I think that covers off on the main topics we wanted to talk about. Brian, is there anything else that you wanted to cover? I know that we have a lot of stuff that we're working on above and beyond this, all very kind of future looking things, but we're going to save some of that for our next webinar. So stay tuned for those. Before we wrap up, anything that you wanted to cover?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, working with the BeBop team has been a joy. It's been very painless, and I couldn't be more thrilled about some of these future use cases that we've started to discuss. And as we continue to kind of blur the lines of what's possible off and on-prem, I think you're going to see that in the next 6 to 12 months, or maybe even sooner, that some of those workflows that we never even imagined being possible in the cloud might be relatively straightforward. So really looking forward to working with the BeBop team in the continuing future, and I appreciate the time.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you very much for joining us today, Brian, and I'll hand it back to Michael to wind us up.
Well, thank you, guys. I think you may have missed the most important thing, and that's when you're doing over the shoulder, you don't have a producer breathing in your ear wanting to touch your computer screen or grab your mouse.
Exactly. And I should mention the editor does have control over which screen to share in OTS.
So in conclusion, Brian, thank you for being here. David, thank you so much for everything you do. I wish I could clone multiple versions of both of you. For everyone still here, NAB is just a few weeks away. I hope all of you are breaking in your shoes. I hope all of you are taking your emergency, because you're going to need it. What I'd like to ask you to do is, when you're at NAB, track us down. There'll be a gaggle of people from BeBop at NAB. Tap us on the shoulder, send us tweets, send us emails, yell our names from South Hall. We'd love to talk to you because what we're doing here at BeBop with all of our partners, including Vice, including Adobe, including Autodesk, is just so exciting. We just want to share it with you. We want to share the technology with you. As you can see on screen, feel free to drop an email to john.miller@beboptechnology.com. BeBop will be, or John will be more than happy to line up some demos and some meetings. And if any of you are interested in kicking the tires, so to speak, on BeBop, we actually have a free trial for 48 hours. There's a link on our website, and and as you can see on your screen right now, you can go to our website and simply download it. Again, thank you, David. Thank you, Brian. And thank you, everyone, for attending, and we'll see you next time.